Is that okay? Can everybody hear me okay? I've made the mistake of doing that before with a kind of microphone up here and then kind of like somebody having to kind of sort of come in after about 5 minutes and move it down. It's just like, oh yeah, that's what you're meant to do with these kind of things, isn't it? So thank you so much for inviting me to come along and speak today about some of the research that we've been doing, looking at a form of psychological therapy for people living with MND. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be kind of sort of setting the scene. So I'm going to be giving a bit of a background about why we conducted this trial in the first place. So I'm going to be talking about the need for psychological support for people living with MND. And then I'm going to just give a brief overview of the clinical guidelines, what the clinical guidelines say with respect to what psychological support should be offered. I'm then going to just give a recap on the evidence to date for psychological therapies for people living with MND. And then I'm going to introduce you just briefly, just because of time, I'm going to introduce you to what acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's such a mouthful, ACT, so what ACT is. And then I'm going to talk about the COMMEND trial, which is a randomized controlled trial of ACT for people living with MND. So why is it important to provide people with that psychological support? We know there are numerous reasons why people should be provided with the support. And the first is that we know that people living with MND and their families kind of face numerous psychological challenges in addition to physical, social, and financial challenges. And some of those challenges include things like the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty in MND due to variability. There's a lot of variability in terms of symptoms experienced, kind of patterns of spread, onset of symptoms, speed of disease progression. There's a lot of variability, and of course all that leads to a lot of uncertainty. We know other challenges include the fact of having to adjust to this diagnosis and then also having to adjust to the losses and the changes that come with it. And there's also the challenge of having to do things like what we call staying ahead of the curve, having to make those decisions about important healthcare issues when you might not be ready for them. So there are lots of different challenges that people experience. We also know that in terms of psychological distress, we know that psychological distress is relatively common. So we know that just under half of people experience symptoms of depression, and just under a third of people experience symptoms of anxiety. And we know that psychological distress in people living with MND is associated with a range of negative outcomes, including things like a poorer quality of life, including things like shorter survival times and increased mortality. We also know from the research that psychological distress can influence the decisions that people make about treatments such as non-invasive ventilation and gastrostomy. So there are lots of reasons why we should be providing psychological support to people living with MND. So what support should we provide? Well, there are lots of guidelines that have been published over the years, and they all really kind of sort of share one thing in common, and that is they just really aren't able to say much about what psychological support should be provided because of the lack of evidence in this area. If we look at the UK NICE clinical guidelines, because these are actually the most comprehensive ones, when we look at kind of like the US or the Canadian ones, it's like one-liners, it's really kind of sort of minimal. If we look at the NICE clinical guidelines, then all they're able to recommend are kind of a few things. They say that we need to discuss how MND is impacting on the person and their family, and their needs kind of should be discussed in terms of all of these different areas that are listed on this slide. So in terms of people's understanding of MND, in terms of how they're kind of adjusting to and coming to terms with the diagnosis, how MND is affecting their daily activities, things like their job, their kind of sort of hobbies, how they're adjusting to those changes, how their relationships are changing, those kind of roles and dynamics in their relationships, how things like their sexuality and intimacy is changing, whether they have concerns about others, and then also in terms of how they want to be able to make decisions. So the NICE guidelines say you need to be able to kind of discuss these kind of areas with the person with MND and their families, and then kind of inquire about their needs. They also say that people should be signposted to sources of support, so things like support groups, things like helplines, websites, etc. And then people should be referred on for additional support, so for specialist services if necessary. And then they also say that people should be given different ways of being able to communicate with the MDT, the multidisciplinary team, as their kind of communication needs change. So the recommendation, and that really is it in terms of the recommendations and the NICE clinical guidelines. They're very vague, and they certainly don't kind of sort of say what type of psychological support should be offered. And that's because of the limited evidence base. Certainly at that time, and still is. So in terms of kind of, so what is the evidence for psychological therapies for people living with MND? These are the studies that have been conducted over the years. When we think about kind of sort of other conditions, when we think of things like cancer, there's no way I'd be able to put all those studies on one slide like this. There are so many studies going on. In comparison, hardly any studies that have been conducted in people living with MND. So that's part of that limited evidence base. And what we know of the studies that have been kind of conducted, they have methodological limitations. So they either have a lack, I don't know if you can just see that orange circle there, but they either have a lack of a control group, so we can't really compare the result. They haven't got a comparison group. Or they have very small sample sizes, so you can't really generalize those findings to kind of sort of a broader population. There are two studies that have offered more promise since the NICE guidelines were published in 2016 and updated in 2019. And these, so one was a randomized controlled trial of meditation training. And this one, it was a great study, but unfortunately, they experienced high dropout rates. So at 6 months, 50%, I think it's over 50% of people had dropped out. By 12 months, it's about 75% of people. And so that really impacts on the kind of the conclusions you can draw. So the best evidence to date comes from the COMMEND trial, which looked at acceptance and commitment therapy for people living with MND, which I'm going to talk you through now. But before that, what is acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT? So ACT is what we call a third wave psychological therapy. And just to put that in context, the first wave of psychological therapies, these behavioral and cognitive therapies, they're focused on changing our behavior. The second wave of behavioral and cognitive therapies, so things like cognitive behavior therapy that you might be much more familiar with, they're focused on trying to change how we think and how we feel. And in contrast, the third wave of psychological therapies are focused on changing our relationship to our thoughts and our feelings. So it's not trying to change the thoughts and feelings, but changing how we relate to them. And ACT is one of these third wave therapies. So ACT, the important thing about ACT is that it's not aimed at symptomatic reduction. So we do see this happening in therapy, but instead it's really focused on helping people to live their lives in ways that are important and meaningful to them alongside the difficulties that they might be experiencing. And it does this by helping people to learn a set of skills around sort of acceptance, mindfulness-based skills, motivation, and behavior change skills. And I'm going to take you through some of those kind of skills just very briefly now. So there are kind of skills in 6 key areas that it tries to kind of develop. One of the skills is about helping people to learn how to open up and make space for difficult thoughts and feelings if it means they can do the stuff that's really important to them or be the type of person they want to be alongside the difficulties they're experiencing. So it's about being willing to have difficult thoughts and feelings in order that you can be who you want to be, say, for example, with MND. Now, I'm sure there are lots of people, I'm sure there are lots of kind of sort of thoughts and feelings coming up this morning about, oh, it's really rainy outside, oh, it's kind of sort of really cold, oh, I'm really tired, oh, I should just go and kind of discover Cork. But instead, kind of you're sitting here, so you potentially had to be willing to have some difficult thoughts and feelings just to be here kind of sort of right now. So that's an example of that skill. Another skill is about learning how to, what we call, unhook from difficult thoughts, to not get so caught up in thoughts and to kind of see thoughts for what they are, just thoughts, rather than kind of sort of, kind of treating them as if they're the literal truth. Another skill is about helping people to connect with the present moment, rather than kind of getting lost in their thoughts about the past or those worries about the future. Another skill is about helping people to kind of see themselves as distinct or separate from their kind of thoughts and their feelings, rather than seeing themselves as defined by that. Another skill is about helping people to notice the things that they really value and care about, what they want to be doing, or the type of person they want to be alongside the difficulties they're experiencing. And then a final skill is about helping people to take action, to do the things they care about, to be the type of person they want to be, even when kind of those difficulties are around. So that's the kind of sort of ACT in a nutshell, and I'm going to be going into much more detail about that this afternoon in a workshop, and I'm going to be giving people some example exercises that we use to help develop those skills. So I'm looking forward to kind of taking people through some of those exercises later if you're interested. So in terms of why we thought that ACT might be suitable for people living with MND, we know from previous research, so previous systematic reviews, that this type of therapy, it's been beneficial, so beneficial outcomes, including things like improvements in functioning, in mood, and in quality of life. They've been reported in other conditions like muscle disorders, chronic pain, and cancer. And so we thought that it might be kind of similarly suitable here too. Another reason we thought that ACT might be particularly suitable is because we thought that some of the techniques that are used in more conventional psychological therapies, such as cognitive behavior therapy, techniques such as looking at the evidence for and against thoughts, we thought that they might either be kind of not as helpful within the context of MND, or they might be perceived as being invalidating. But what we didn't know was whether something like ACT is helpful for people living with MND, whether it kind of represents good value for money as well. And so that's what we aim to explore in the COMMEND trial. So in terms of the COMMEND trial, this was a 3-phase project that was funded by the NIHR and the MND Association. In the first phase of the study, we conducted a series of interviews with people living with MND, with carers, with healthcare professionals, in order to be able to find out what a psychological therapy in intervention kind of should look like for them, and also how we should adapt it to meet their specific needs. And we used those findings from those interviews to be able to adapt an intervention that was based on ACT and kind of suitable for people living with MND. We then conducted a small, what we call an uncontrolled feasibility study. So it was a very small study, it didn't have a comparison group, and we were just mainly looking at, okay, is this, first of all, is this acceptable to people? And is it feasible to deliver this kind of therapy? So we did a small uncontrolled study, and we found that, yes, it was acceptable and it was feasible. And we found that there was some suggestion that it might help to maintain people's psychological well-being. But obviously, it was a small study, and we didn't have that comparison group, so we couldn't draw any strong conclusions. And so that's why we aim to evaluate this in a larger randomized controlled trial, which was co-led by myself and Chris McDermott at the University of Sheffield. So in terms of what we actually did in this clinical trial, so we recruited 191 people living with ALS, PMA or PLS, and we recruited people irrespective of whether they were experiencing anxiety or depression symptoms. So people didn't have to be feeling anxious or depressed to be involved in the study. We recruited people from 16 M&D care centres and clinics around the UK, and also via self-referral. This map shows we had a good geographical spread across the UK. We did actually, I was saying to somebody earlier, we did try to get a site in Ireland, but it just wasn't kind of feasibly possible in the end. So people were chosen at random to receive ACT plus usual care or usual care alone. And people were who were chosen to have ACT, they had that in person or via video call. And actually, in the end, because this happened during the pandemic, I think it was something like 80% or 85% of the sessions happened via video call in the end. The main thing that we were interested in was quality of life, and we measured this using the McGill Quality of Life questionnaire at 6 months, but we were interested in a range of other outcomes too, including things like anxiety, depression, functioning, and costs. And we were also interested in how satisfied people were with the intervention. In terms of the results, so you're not going to be able to kind of see that slide from the number. Well, if you can see the slide from where you are, then you've got like supervision. But in terms of the results, we had so 97 people were chosen at random to have ACT plus usual care, 94 usual care alone. And we had, at 6 months, we had a good retention. So 81% of people were retained in the study at that point. So that other large trial that I talked about at 6 months, they had 50% of people dropping out. So we had good kind of sort of retention rates, which kind of says something about the acceptability as well. In terms of those characteristics of people who signed up to the study and were chosen at random to receive ACT plus usual care or usual care alone, so the majority of people self-identified as male, in their 60s, they self-identified as white British and as being in a relationship. The most common diagnosis was ALS, and people were most commonly diagnosed within the kind of the past year. And the rates of clinically significant depression and anxiety were relatively low. So in terms of what we actually found, we found that ACT plus usual care was superior to usual care alone for maintaining or improving quality of life at 6 months. And the pattern results was essentially a small increase in quality of life in the ACT plus usual care arms, that's the blue line, combined with a decline in quality of life in the usual care alone arm, so that's the orange arm. And those beneficial effects were maintained at 9 months. We also found that ACT plus usual care was superior to usual care alone for maintaining mood, so mood declined in the usual care group. We also found that ACT plus usual care was superior for reducing what we call psychological inflexibility, and that's specifically what ACT aims to increase. And we also found that ACT plus usual care was superior to usual care alone on a brief single-item measure of health status. So when people were asked how good or bad their health was on a scale from 0 to 100, we can see that health status was maintained in the ACT arm, but it declined in the usual care arm. So I'm just going to skip through that because of time. In terms of other outcomes, we found further evidence to support the acceptability of ACT. So 70% of people attended 8 sessions. So people offered up to 8 sessions, and 70% of people attended all 8. And we had high kind of satisfaction rates as well. And we also showed that ACT was cost-effective in a subgroup of people experiencing a medium rate of deterioration. So this is some of the feedback that we got in the trial. So people kind of mentioned things like that it was very helpful to come to terms with things. It can help you understand and have inner peace. Other people said the therapy was useful as it gave me some coping strategies and the ability to address problems from a different perspective. Many of the examples have relevance to my day-to-day activities and thoughts. Another person said, I can now be the person I want to be whilst living with MND. I intend to spend the rest of my life concentrating on what matters to me and the disease. Another person said, I'm new to MND and early stages. It's good to learn now and prepare. And another person said, it's encouraged me to prioritize my values. So in terms of the strengths of the study, so the main strength really was the first adequately powered study of any psychological intervention for people living with MND. And it was also the first clinical trial to look at ACT for this population. We had a broad range of regions across the UK, from Glasgow all the way down to Plymouth. And we showed that we could develop an intervention that could be delivered remotely, so obviously increasing its accessibility. The main limitations are the fact that we didn't have what we call an active control condition. And this is because the NIHR, the funder, wanted ACT to be compared to what was kind of sort of being delivered as per usual in clinical services. And what that means is that we don't know whether the effects that we saw were due to the intervention or perhaps due to what we call non-specific therapeutic factors, the fact that somebody is sitting in front of a therapist, receiving that support and that attention. The fact that we saw those decreases in psychological inflexibility with the intervention supports that it was the intervention reducing these results, but obviously we can't be 100% certain. We also know that participants from ethnic minorities were underrepresented, which means we can't generalize these findings to broader population. We also know that, from when I showed you those baseline characteristics, we had low rates of people experiencing clinically significant anxiety and depression, so it might not be as representative of people coming to MND clinics as we'd want. And of course, so we don't know whether any benefits were maintained after 9 months, because we didn't follow up people beyond that time point. Now, if you're interested in hearing about any of these, reading more about this, then the links to the studies are all here, and I'm assuming you're going to get some of these slides sent to you afterwards, and these papers are all free to access. If you want to hear about a participant's experience of being involved in the study, so Dr. Jenny Starkey took part in a video blog with us, and she shares her experiences there. And you can also read Professor Eva Sundin's experience. So she wasn't involved in the Commend trial. She came to ACT in her own way, but she kind of talks about her experiences in the conversation. If you're interested in psychological information about psychological support, then have a look at the links here that link you to various information about that. So just to conclude then, we showed that ACT can help people to manage their psychological well-being and their quality of life, and that it was clinically helpful. But we do need more of those high-quality, adequately powered RCTs, particularly those ones with proper placebo controls. And in conclusion, our kind of findings also provide important kind of, they should highlight the importance of providing that psychological support and that showing that people should have access to this psychological support, as noted in this Lancet editorial. So before I finish, I just want to say a couple of thanks. So to everybody involved in the trials, in terms of the participants and therapists, to the trial team, and then to the funders, the NIHR and the MND Association. Thank you, everybody.